Thank you all for joining us today. I am Mike Schlanger, Vice President at Merrill Corporation, and I also serve as the Vice Chairman of XBRL US, and I'll be your moderator. We have an eye-opening program where we'll explore how the SEC's Enforcement Division is increasingly using big and structured data to fulfill its mission. We gave you a peek into the box as you were signing in today of how the consumption and processing of data is changing with the use of XBRL and structured data. And we'll discuss and show this more during the presentation. First, housekeeping. Questions. If you have questions, there's a chat widget. Please enter them and we will try to get to them during the course of the program, or after we will make arrangements to answer some of the questions you have. There will be a link to the replay within 48 hours. If you thought the program was helpful, I encourage you to pass it on to colleagues, especially the legal departments where financial reporting representatives are on the line, to give some insights into what's going on the Enforcement Division. We will have a download available on the resources widget on your screen, and following the presentation we will have a survey, and we encourage you to fill it in because it helps us track how to make these programs better. For those applying for CPE credit, there are 3 polling questions you will need to answer. All of you will need to submit an answer to facilitate your slides moving forward, even if you're not applying for credit. And a certificate will be available when you met the criteria. Our speakers, I'm excited. It's a very distinguished panel. I'm joined by Elizabeth Gray, who's a partner in the litigation department, co-chair of Securities Enforcement Practice Group at Wilkie Farr and Gallagher. Howard Kaplan, data analyst at the Center for Risk and Quantitative Analysis at the SEC. Howard has just come back from a trip to Puerto Rico on loan from our government to help in the rebuilding efforts. If we had time, I think you'd appreciate hearing his story, but unfortunately, we're just talking about big data today. Lou Roman is our own Merrill Corporation Vice President of XBRL Services. He also serves as the chairman of XBRL US Data Quality Committee. To start, Lou, it would be good for you to define what we mean when we throw terms around like big or structured data.
Yeah, Mike, big data, my definition of it, any significantly large amount of data that gets mined or analyzed to produce useful information. So generally it refers to large amounts of data that didn't even exist 5 years ago, probably didn't even exist 1 year ago in many cases, and many cases didn't exist 1 week ago. But I think the key here when we talk about big data is to break it down into 2 different sections or categories: structured data and unstructured data. So structured data on the left side is the data that's organized according to some predefined manner. An example, probably the simplest example, is a relational database with rows and columns, which today seems kind of old-fashioned actually, but that is structured data. Probably a more sophisticated example of structured data would be tag data such as XML, extensible markup language, or the XBRL format, which is extensible business reporting language. Those 2 are examples of structured data. On the right side, unstructured data, that's data that's really not organized according to a predefined format, much more complex to analyze, unstructured data. And a simple example of that is if you think of all the data that's in videos that are posted on LinkedIn, let's say in the past month, a lot of data, a lot of unstructured, actually very unstructured data. So this webinar is going to focus more on structured data on the left side. Part of the reason for that is the SEC in 2009 started a program to give public access to a large data set of structured data, and that data set is the financial reporting in XBRL, which is provided to the SEC by SEC registrants. And the purpose for that, of course, was to make the financial data machine readable by having it tagged in XBRL for the purpose of having it being more efficient and accurately consumed by users of the data. This has expanded well beyond the U.S. Since 2009. The XBRL really has become a global standard. The requirements by regulators to provide financials in a structured format is growing very significantly. Some of the recent developments that we've seen, there's a mandate in the European Union for all listed EU companies starting in 2020, and they have to submit their financials in XBRL starting at that time. The European Commission recently passed a law that said there's going to be a European single electronic format, meaning a single structure for data format. And what the EU chose was XBRL, specifically inline XBRL for that format that all companies in the EU will have to use. Also, the SEC is now requiring foreign private issuers to submit financials in IFRS using the XBRL format, starting with periods ending on or after December 15th of 2017. So when we see the 20Fs coming in the spring, they will have to include XBRL with them. There's many other implementations of XBRL structured data around the world, not just the two shown on the screen, but it seems that those without an XBRL program are becoming somewhat the minority. And the requirement and use of XBRL goes far beyond just the SEC or regulators. In the past, even on this webinar, we've heard from Emil Efthymides from Bloomberg. He's talked about how Bloomberg is using the structured data from the tagged XBRL filings, not only from the SEC, but the regulators of multiple companies or multiple countries. Bloomberg is using those specifically to populate an increasing amount of information that they provide on their screens and to their customers. So, Mike, that's the quick version of big data and structured data. And again, we'll be focusing more on structured data for this webinar, but I'll send it back to you, Mike.
Great. We have a poll question that will be popping up. Again, everyone will need to submit an answer in order for your slides to move forward. The question is, to what extent do you think the SEC staff is using structured data for internal analysis? While you're answering, let's move on. Employing the old adage of pictures are worth 1,000 words, before I turn the program over to Howard, let me show you some examples of how structured data that Lou just defined and many of you provide the SEC in your XBRL filings, brings data to life. As mentioned, you got a peek in the box when you were logging on if you came early. We showed the power of XBRL to conduct broad searches and then drill downs into a company disclosure to achieve an instant visual presentation of key data points. Those and other graphs we will be showing today were generated by an XBRL data provider, Audacity, a contractor to the SEC. There's another contractor to the SEC, CalcBench. I encourage you to visit their websites to learn more about them because this is part of the tool set that the SEC is employing. Now, 3 examples I want to just focus on. These came from Mike Willis at the SEC in an interview in our September Dimensions publication. It's on your screen to the right where you can download it. But the 3 examples I'm going to use are, first, the pull of data to compare disclosure and specific sector risk profiles across a target group. And as you see, instead of going into each file 10K or 10Q and trying to find a piece of data, the structuring of the data allows us to pull this broad spectrum instantly, and in the specific information we're looking for, an outlier is identified. Secondly, if we're looking for a broad analysis, a broad disclosure across all filers for a target period, and I've isolated here unremitted foreign earnings, which is such in the spotlight with this tax bill consideration. instead of, again, going into every file and taking days to find that one piece of information, having it structured allows that instant pull of data. And then finally, if there are a specific combination of disclosures that may reveal a risk pattern, similarly, the data pull shows a graph that an examiner, an analyst can see very clearly something that's going on, whether good or bad. Now, moving on, Howard, you've been at this for a number of years. We've had discussions. It would be helpful to tell the audience what the Enforcement Division is doing, how it uses data contained in filings, and how big data is impacting your work, and what source of data are you using?
Hi. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. I'll begin by the disclaimer that the remarks I'm about to express are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Commission, the commissioners, or members of any staff.
One thing I have to say, Howard has no slides. I forgot to mention that. So you're going to see his picture and no slides. So that there's not a problem with your webinar. Go ahead, Howard.
If I thought you were going to leave my picture up there, I would have used a much older one. Anyway, so in preparing for this panel, I was asked to describe how enforcement uses structured data. And in fact, when you think of structured data in the broadest sense, it's really baked into the majority of our work. XBRL is one very important source. As was mentioned before, there's other sources of structured data that we use. And the majority of the cases that we bring, as well as the many others that never get brought, are predicated on some analytics using structured and to some degree unstructured data. You probably won't see references to, say, XBRL in any of the press releases or the legal filings, but it's in there, just as we use other data sources like trace. You're not going to see that mentioned either. It's really about the analytics and making a particular case for a violation rather than a focus on the data set involved. My perspective is that of a downstream user of structured data. I simply try to get my hands on the best data that I can for my purposes, and in at least for the past couple of years, that's been XBRL. I should also mention that I'll be talking mostly about violations, bad actors, and so forth, but the vast majority of filers are in compliance or they want to be. I'm looking for material violations, repeat violations, not just technicalities and gotchas. So please keep that in mind as well. I had once come across this cartoon that said that there's no big data, only small tools, and I think that is more and more proving to be the case. What was once big data is now just pretty manageable, and the goal that I have is taking this vast amount of data and trying to whittle it down into something that's workable, a small data set that I can then use for further analytics. As I said before, structured data is critical to our enforcement work. Most of the press you see about our data analytics is about insider trading, aberrational performance, market manipulation, things like that. But I can tell you that structured data is used extensively in most of our cases, and the ones I'll focus on today are about disclosure and accounting violations, which are very different kinds of cases to bring. The role that structured data plays in enforcement, at least in certainly the work that I'm familiar with, there's a few things. One is that we use it for data integration. So we might use as a starting point a structured data filing, and from that extract identifiers, names, related parties, metadata, attach, looking for things like tickers, QSIPs, entity names, CIKs, and that enables us then to cross it with other data sets like market data, other filings, unstructured data, and present a much more complete picture about a registrant or an event than you might just get from that initial XBRL filing. So it also positions us well for what will be coming up in the future, like the legal entity identifier and the consolidated audit trail. So that is one important use of data integration, of structured data, in giving us a platform on which we can then do more analysis. I use XBRL and structured data in general extensively to do things like grouping, classifying, clustering companies by particular properties. So I might take the footnote number 1, and which is block tagged, and then run it through text analytics to sort of get a sense of clustering companies by how close their footnote number 1 might be might be written, or the kinds of issues or terminology that it uses. And this is very instructive in trying to find obvious and also non-obvious peer groups, because if we start to find violations with a particular company that are, where we've initially started to get the, initial signals from footnotes, we can very quickly then find other companies, other registrants who've done something similar. And it cuts across things like industry sectors or market cap. We're really looking at the content of the filing. We also use, of course, quantitative methods on the financial statements themselves. We use XBRL data and structured data to link registrants by common elements, to look for things like officers, directors, related entities, legal counsel, auditors, filing preparers, things like that. Because when we find cases of probable violations, we can also look at other companies like this. And all the different kinds of analysis that we do for filings, for all the filings, we will also do that in a more focused way when we find anomalies or poor data quality and poor submissions on the XBRL side. So we come across things like negative fact values, data entry errors, a lot of use of extensions for common line items and so forth. This is work that's really being, I'd say, the lead for this is the work that DERA does in the Office of Structured Data. They are really the ones that execute on this most effectively, and we are users of that work. But we are looking at registrants who are submitting XBRL filings where it's sloppy or there are errors. In my opinion, these filings are the public and regulatory face of a registrant. So if a registrant submits a filing with errors and one of poor data quality, it's likely to have other issues as well. And as I think my colleague Mike Willis said, and it's so true, you never just find one cockroach. If these filing errors, if these anomalies can be compared to cockroaches, you can be sure that there are more in that same filing. And we like to look at it for other substantive issues. Very quickly, I'll just say that we use, that some of the techniques we use include machine learning, taking known cases of violations, running the structured data through these analytical engines, and finding distilling the filings into a set of defined variables, and that helps us to find other types of violations like that. We'll also mesh that with things like market data, social media data, non-public data that we have, news information, and so forth. And again, we do that quite closely with our colleagues in DERA who really have a lot of expertise in that. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Greg.
Thank you, Howard. I do have one follow-up question because we've talked about this, but in your cockroach analogy, you've mentioned that the XBRL quality error has triggered questions, and in prior conversations you've mentioned that it's not just XBRL data then you're going to look at more, but that actually triggers you looking often into the Edgar filing. Is that an accurate statement?
It is, and it's not just the Edgar filings. It goes into a bucket where we look at our internal case management system, which contains records of all the investigative work we've done. We look at non-public filings. We'll look at data that's in on the internet. We'll cross it with data that our colleagues from FINRA give us and other government entities. So we have quite a lot of data sets to run these things against. We don't just do with XBRL anomalies. There's all kinds of stuff that will trigger that kind of a search. But certainly, if a company is really egregious in the way that it's filed its XBRL filing, then it's very straightforward to treat it as if it's a matter of interest.
Well, thank you. All right, I'm going to turn now to Elizabeth. You spent 12 years working in the enforcement division with your last assignment as assistant director before entering private practice. It'll be great to give our audience your perspective on how big data is impacting the enforcement division's practices, what you see today, and what you think might be relevant for your clients and all filers to know about what's going on. I want to note before turning it to her that I applaud you and your firm's efforts to bring this issue to the forefront of SEC enforcement and big data. First in the publication Review of Securities and Commodities Regulation in June of 2017, and now available in our October issue of Dimensions, which you can also get on the right side of your screen. But it's important because in all of my work, I find most of the legal community have run away from XBRL and structured data, and I think your comments you're going to share today are very impactful and something that more lawyers need to take into account. So, Elizabeth?
Thank you, and thanks for having me. Well, I would say that big data is changing SEC enforcement in very significant ways. I would say most importantly, it is much more proactive. Enforcement has become much more proactive than it has been in the past because of its access to big data. And in addition to being more proactive, it's also less reliant on the statements of those who are being investigated. It's able to corroborate statements or disprove statements more than the enforcement division has been able to do in the past. So first, how does data analytics work, sort of big picture at the SEC? How has it changed just so dramatically from my time there? And it's really, I would say, has changed most dramatically over the last 5 to 6 years. So the SEC has always had access to large quantities of information about public companies, about investment advisors and broker-dealers, all the entities that it regulates. And the information has been in public filings from those issuers, from those companies, whether it's in registration statements or 10Ks or 8Ks for issuers, or Form ADVs for investment advisors. So it's the mandatory disclosures that the SEC has imposed on those that they regulate and then has had that information. So what is different now? What's different is the amount of resources that the SEC has thrown at the big data that it has in its possession and the emergence of how the data is presented. Of course, XBRL being most significant. So in terms of resources, as Howard mentioned, there is a division of economic and risk analysis. He called it DERA. That was established in 2009 and grew very substantially. It now has over, I think, 200 people in it. There are attorneys, economists, analysts, computer programmers, all working together, developing and providing economic and statistical analysis that's used throughout the agency and very significantly in the Division of Enforcement. In 2014, and this was under the prior chair, Mary Jo White, the SEC created an Office of Risk Assessment within DERA that really focused on financial and risk modeling related to either the issuers, broker-dealers, investment advisors, and also trading platforms. And that had a significant impact because it was just such a focused effort, and also worked in conjunction with Howard's office within the Division of Enforcement to identify potential cases. And sort of within that, there is this corporate issuer risk assessment, which expands on an accounting model to detect anomalous patterns in financial reporting, and that can trigger additional inquiry. And the result of all this, of these sort of devoted resources, both in terms of the technology itself and the number of people who are devoted within the organization of the SEC, is that the SEC can effectively compare filings for abnormalities, patterns, outliers, and all the trends that Mike initially and Lou, you identified when you began this presentation. So what does that mean for the actual investigations, the actual enforcement program at the SEC? Until relatively recently, the program was very reactive, not proactive particularly. So when I say reactive, I mean there were sources of information that came into the SEC. It would be whistleblowers. It may be referrals from the operating divisions within the SEC, such as the Division of Corporation Finance or the Division of Market Regulation at the time I was there. Now it's called Trading and Markets, or from self-regulatory organizations. And that was really the bulk of what came into the SEC for cases. And the division was very much dependent upon those sources of information bringing it to them. And, there was some criticism that the SEC was really too reactive, that it should have been thinking ahead as to where the market was going, where the market risks were. And with the meltdown of, 2009 of the economy, a real consideration of what can the SEC do better in terms of identifying risks and potential cases. And that's, I think, that was a really large impetus behind the sort of initial shift of looking more at data. What can we do? What can the SEC do to get a bigger picture and not be so reactive? And in fact, with this emergence of the use of big data, the increased resources focusing on big data, the SEC has been able to become more proactive. So that's the big change, reactive to much more proactive. So I can give you an example of when I was there. We would look for financial cases, accounting cases, by tracking announcements that companies made through Bloomberg. And, there were a number of people who would really just stay in the Bloomberg terminal. These are senior folks, right, looking to see what's going on in the markets, where should we be investigating, and they would track announcements that came through Bloomberg about financial statements. So if there was an 8K, a Form 8K, for example, that was filed announcing the resignation of auditors, bam, enforcement would open up an investigation. Let's go try to find out why they changed auditors. Phone calls would start. Or if there is an announcement of a restatement, bam, open an investigation, figure out what's going on. So as you can see, pretty reactive there. Now, with the databases that I referenced earlier and the ability to analyze data that's in the filings, the SEC is able to sort of see trends. There may be sort of a trend of resignations of auditors for a particular group of companies. They can look at, are there particular segments that seem to be having problems financially or revenue issues. So it's a very different way of analyzing, what is actually going to be part of a case. And so by harnessing that power, the SEC, that technology, the resources and the data, the SEC is much more able to bring and think about cases proactively. I think it's worth touching on some of the areas where they are using the technology to bring cases. The financial accounting and fraud area, as Howard said, is one where it's used frequently. I have seen it as a practitioner, sort of most obviously, I would say, in the insider trading area. The analytics are very powerful in that area. I think that in many ways that's where the SEC was used to using data analytics to identify cases. When I was there, we would work with FINRA to get data. We'd actually get blue sheets and literally sit in a room and look at the blue sheet, the trading data, to identify whether there were clusters of people from Savannah, Georgia, who traded before, an FDA announcement when their cousin was working at the FDA. I mean, that's how a lot of the insider trading cases were built 15 years ago. Now there is an ability to input sort of a program that really will trigger lots of information, so there will be patterns of trading will emerge. And within the SEC's enforcement division, they have various units. The market abuse unit is really using the insider trading programs to identify insider trading cases and doing it really successfully. And at times they will actually reference that fact that they're using the data analytics to get the cases, and they're coordinating closely with the U.S. attorney's offices to bring those kind of insider trading cases. And they have a real advantage because they see the pattern of data that if you individually, if you're representing somebody, don't see. You see what your client has told you, you see what your client has done, but you don't have the bigger picture that the SEC has. And so it allows the SEC, as I said earlier, to be a bit more independent than they have in the past because they really have a broader vision than even the people who are being investigated have. Cybersecurity is another area where cases are being brought, and it's a very active area. That is also part of the market abuse unit. So there have been cases that have been identified where cybersecurity problems are, whether it's a breach that results in some sort of stealing of data, a breach that may result in insider trading by virtue of someone coming in, taking confidential information from a company and trading on it. Those cases have been assisted really tremendously by the use of big data. And I think one, point that Mary Jo White, the former chair, who really focused on expanding the big data use that the SEC was committed to was, even if our resources decline, which it ebbs and flows, it's a political agency, an independent agency, but in fact funded, so it becomes political. She knew that was one way to keep the agency strong because there is just this access to information and a leveraging of that kind of information that help people bring cases and be proactive without needing more and more people to do the investigations themselves. The other point that I think with big data that's important to note as a practitioner is it allows the SEC to corroborate information more easily. They, as I said earlier, have a bigger picture in front of them very often. They can test what people are telling them. They can test, defenses much more than they had been able to do in the past. And then I think finally it's important to note, and Howard mentioned this also, is, big data is always changing, right? There's always more information coming in, more sources of information. With the consolidated audit trail that was approved by the Commission in 2016 and will be coming into effect, lots of data will be coming in about trading, trade executions, cancellations, and it'll go back for a period of time, which will give the SEC also some ability to test, information that they have in investigations or to think about additional cases. With all that, I don't think one should consider cooperation and whistleblowing, sort of gone by the wayside. I think that will always continue to be an important part of the SEC's enforcement program. You'll still be considering whether your clients should come in and, provide information to the SEC up front or how much they should cooperate during the course of an investigation. But you will understand that the SEC may not be quite as reliant upon issuers or people during the investigation to cooperate as they have been in the past, and so can sort of flex their muscles a bit more with the use of their big data. Okay.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to move on. Nope, I went too far here. I'm going to go back to Howard. And Howard, if you could provide a little more insight into the investigations or cases that can be traced back to structured data analytical efforts, I think that would be helpful for our audience to understand. And an issue you referenced in the opening remarks about XBRL quality issues and how that impacts your work and what you do when confronted with them. Now, some of this you covered, but give us some insights into the cases and use, and obviously some of the sand in the gas tank that might occur when you come upon an XBRL or quality issue.
Hi, thanks, Mike. So I can talk about a couple of cases in maybe a bit more of a general way than people might prefer, but at least to give you an idea of what the how a case is brought using this type of using this data set and the analytics that we have access to. So these are specifically around disclosure and accounting violations. Elizabeth was terrific in giving an overview of all the different types of ways that structured data figures into the work that we do. I have, in my experience, the accounting type cases, the disclosure cases are they take longer to bring, and but I think with the use of, we're able to be much more proactive because we can look for disclosure violations where we were expecting something to happen and it didn't. So one example is we had brought a case where a registrant, and it turned into a sweep of multiple registrants, had not properly disclosed a significant dilution event between reporting periods. So these companies would they would trigger an action that would dilute the holdings of the shareholders, and there would be no 8K filed. And we were able to, just using the XBRL filings, the footnotes and so forth, very quickly and in a very straightforward way, look at percentage dilution between filing periods, and where it was material, then go and see whether or not there was an 8K that disclose that event between those periods. And it's a surprising number that happens, and we are able to now turn that into a periodic analysis that we run, and it's a kind of an investigation factory because this seems to continue to happen in spite of the cases we bring and the warnings that we issue. And we're able to do this with basically all the different kinds of events that an 8K should trigger that would be reported in a periodic filing, but not in say an 8K. So issues like revenue recognition, different kinds of accrual issues, changes in officers and directors. There's for every type of 8K event, there is usually a connection back to either the XBRL filing or the 10K, 10Q in general. So we look at the MD&A, we look at all of the various pieces, whether they're structured or not, and look for 8Ks that should have been filed and are not. And and then we can refer those to an enforcement team to decide whether or not they're going to pick it up. And you can imagine that, I mean, there's so many different SEC rules and GAAP requirements on disclosure of material events. And so to the extent that that is described in an XBRL filing or an XML filing, we're able to then look and see whether or not something that should have been disclosed was not. And that is a very substantive thing because it goes to the heart of investor protection. As we were talking about before, what sort of the noise in all of this is when registrants file XBRL filings that are of a poor data quality. They use a lot of extensions for, say, revenue where there really isn't any reason to, or maybe there's a reason to, but it just isn't obvious initially. They'll use reverse signs. There'll be like extra fat finger errors where they'll put in multiple zeros and so forth. And what ends up happening is in our screening process, the ones that use these extensions extensively just go in the bucket of look at these more closely. And so it seems to me that it would be to the advantage of a registrant to be quite careful about the XBRL filings as much as they are with the regular statutory filings, because we use them for screening. And until I get to a small enough set of companies where I can start looking at things more manually, I've got to treat the ones that are using extensions extensively or other types of errors, whether they're validation errors or whatever, as if this is, a matter of interest. And more often than not, there's nothing there. But it would seem to me that it would be in a registrant's interest to try to not even go in that bucket in the first place, because we're just forced to use heuristics and screening to figure out which companies to focus on, and the ones that submit filings of poor data quality end up being part of the group that gets looked at more closely. Mike?
Thank you, Howard. I hope everyone's listening, and I'm going to use some more pictures to bring Howard's words about XBRL quality to life. Our first example, imagine yourself as an examiner or in the enforcement division. You're reviewing the topic we mentioned earlier, unremitted foreign earnings, and you're looking at the top providers or top companies with those numbers, and a couple things one thing stands out. Here's one that had $104 billion in 2011, but with the data pool, again, across a whole set, in this case, it's the larger ones, that drops to $100 million over the next 4-year period. Certainly, when you dig in and you know the company's name, you realize that's not possible. It's an error. Secondly, is the signage area. error. Here again, you see with the scatter plot, most companies have the same effective tax rate, but one pops out at you. It's got a negative 27% rate. I think all of you would love that. But when you dig into the Edgar, there's an error. They actually have a positive 27% tax effective rate. What's interesting to me, or what's sort of astounding to me, is I've talked to hundreds of companies that have made these kinds of errors, and rarely are they aware that those errors are being made. So, Lou, the majority of our audience are accounting professionals who prepare their company XBRL filing submissions. Howard just explained the challenges of using the data and the consequence of more scrutiny when they find those problems. You've been living in XBRL land for 10 years and have established yourself as one of the absolute foremost experts in XBRL. What's going on here? How can companies who are so, careful about every piece of data in the SEC filing make these mistakes, and what can you offer as advice?
Yeah, the errors like the ones you've shown are not done on purpose. I agree with you with that. And most of the time the filer doesn't even know that that error exists in their filing. The errors we see in filings are made too often by a smart person that's doing a great job with the traditional paper-based financials and is doing their absolute best with the XBRL financials, but the person's unknowing of certain items where they're communicating something different in the XBRL tagged financials versus what's being communicated in the printed HTML financials. It simply happens too often. The core reasons for that, your question, first there may be a lack of technical knowledge. Oftentimes the case, an XBRL preparer or a reviewer technically needs to know what's going on, meaning they need to know the SEC's Edgar Filer Manual rules. They need to also be familiar with the taxonomy itself, the standard list of tags, and the annual changes to it. Technical knowledge also means understanding the accounting disclosures themselves, especially for the more complex accounting items, and then also the requirements of XBRL itself, meaning the features and structures of XBRL, understanding how it works. If the preparer isn't knowledgeable about one of those items, that item will likely get tagged and structured improperly, and the preparer may not even be aware of the problem. We always say you don't know what you don't know. So although it may seem right, it's not. And Mike, the technical knowledge is a core reason for these errors. But aside from the technical knowledge, there's also other reasons for the errors. Another one is what I call quarter-to-quarter complacency. And this problem is based on the idea that my XBRL was right last quarter, so I'm going to keep everything the same this quarter. Well, that sounds good for consistency purposes. There's changes to the taxonomy that occur annually, changes to the SEC rules, and more things. And these changes require updates, so there's really no place for complacency. Another one, thirdly, there's a natural turnover in the financial reporting departments of public companies. And that person that understands the XBRL may move to a different role or leave the company, and the new person gets transitioned and does the best possible they can, but really doesn't understand what the XBRL is communicating until they've got a little more experience with it, and that calls what I will just call transition errors. Fourth, there's an over-reliance on software to get XBRL right. There's lots of software tools out there, and they help you build a file. So you can use them to start building your XBRL and tagging, but without the proper expert knowledge of the right way to do it, which are those technical items I mentioned before, the software can't operate and do things properly on its own, no matter how good it appears to be doing that. So software isn't responsible for getting the XBRL right, so don't expect it to do that. Another reason for these errors, a fifth one, is resource constraints. So if there isn't enough time and resources in the financial reporting department due to either hiring constraints or other priorities, then the XBRL is going to get squeezed out of the time it really needs to have it done right. And that can oftentimes be a more top-level culture issue. Is upper management providing or allowing the right resources? Possibly upper management isn't aware of the consequences of providing the bad XBRL. So that's another factor. And then lastly, I'll put here that the company has a low care factor, as I call it, because they haven't been alerted of any of the errors, and they believe there aren't any direct consequences to having errors. So the thinking really is I think my XBRL is okay, or it's probably good enough. Well, because of the increased use of XBRL by the consumers of the data, that logic is no longer going to work. It may very well have squeaked by 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, but those days are over. Because of the increased usage of XBRL, the errors that were made 2 years ago are showing up now in analysis, where they're doing looking back 3 years in the analysis. And the errors that are made today, they're showing up not only today, but they'll show up in analysis 2 years from now as well. So there are consequences. So those are some of the reasons for the errors that are being made, but let's turn now to the steps companies can take to prevent the errors in the XBRL filings. You need to divide them into two categories: those steps that to prevent errors that can be detected by automation, and then those that can't be detected by automation. For the errors that can be, on the left side, it's as simple as running some software against the XBRL files to check them for errors. Every company should be running and following validations. There's 3 validations. One is XBRL validation, and that checks that the XBRL filing uses the right technical specifications. I think most companies have that one covered because most softwares will do that. But a second validation is the SEC validation, and that performs syntactical checks that ensure the document will be accepted by the SEC. It's an SEC test filing. Thirdly, the XBRL US Data Quality Committee rules should be run. And what they do is they perform evaluations on the content of the XBRL document itself. And I'm the chair of that Data Quality Committee, and I'll say that those rules, they aren't lightweight rules. They're developed with the utmost care and depth of knowledge, so they're really strong rules. So those checks should be run by companies before the SEC filing, so that errors can be detected before the company sends in the filing. And fortunately, any company can run those rules free of charge. That was one of the key ideas behind the DQC, is to allow companies to do this at no cost. So the DQC rules have really created a significant improvement in the types of errors for which they are looking at. In general, what we've seen is that for every error type that's checked by the DQC rule, 2/3 of the errors vanish. I mean, they're corrected soon after we publish the rules. So that's very encouraging and very happy to see that. But it also makes me think about, what about the 1/3 of the errors that remain? They're problematic. And let's just say, I hope those companies are listening today so that they understand this and can run those rules and get those errors corrected. For those errors that can't be detected by automation, there's an overriding item that keeps surfacing related to making sure these errors don't occur. And based on my experience, and the more I've talked to filers, to experts, to others in the industry, there's that one principle stands out to get that part of the XBRL right. And that principle is that a filer must have a knowledgeable XBRL individual involved with the filing. And that individual can be internal or external. It doesn't matter to the company. But if the company is deficient on this, good quality is just not going to happen. So what is a knowledgeable XBRL individual? I'll define that. It's really a person that understands, firstly, the regulator's rules, especially the SEC's Edgar Filer Manual rules, which do take some time to digest, and also the SEC staff observations and FAQs and changes to them. A second thing is the familiarity with the taxonomy itself, whether it's US GAAP or IFRS, whichever one's being used. Knowing the taxonomy is critical to getting the XBRL right, especially since there's annual changes to it. It's important to be current. I've seen changes to the taxonomy whereby the company didn't know about the change. They weren't paying attention necessarily, and they erroneously left the tagging as it had been previously done. Well, those errors unfortunately often remain in the file for several subsequent quarters as well, and do cause, as Mike was saying, sand in the gas tank. A third one, a knowledgeable individual knows the XBRL structures, the features, and the specifications. So they get the XBRL right because they know, they understand XBRL itself. Another one is accounting disclosures. Many of you on this call are strong accountants, and I believe you've got this one covered, hopefully. However, if you do get assistance with XBRL tagging either inside or outside the company, does that person, especially if they're a service provider, do they fully understand the accounting disclosures? It's impossible to tag XBRL properly unless you understand what's being tagged. So overall, to prevent the errors that can't be detected by automation, my advice is for all filers to do an assessment of their knowledge related to these components, and then look at each item and ask yourself if you have it covered. And for any items that the answer is no or maybe, and that's where the errors are occurring, it's key to identify that risk specifically and make sure you've got it corrected or covered. Mike, that's the reason for the errors and some of the steps to prevent them, so I'll send it back to you.
Excellent. And we have a poll question that I'm not going to read in the interest of time, but again, you'll need to fill that out. And I'm going to move lastly to Elizabeth. We've talked a lot about the enforcement use of big data. It appears there could be some risks our listeners should be aware of. And if you can provide insight into what some of these may be and what you advise they start doing differently in response to them, I think that'd be very helpful.
Absolutely. So, yeah, big data, the use of big data, proactive enforcement, that is all the new normal. And we just sort of have to accept that, and that's not going away. In fact, I think it will expand with the consolidated audit trail and with sort of some of the hiring freezes that are going on at the SEC. So there'll be an increased use of big data. So what should you think about as a registrant, as somebody who has to deal with the SEC, if you deal with them directly or through your general counsel? The registrants no longer have the informational advantage. The SEC has a big picture through the data. So they may have insight into issues that you may not even know about and may not be aware of. And so when you are interacting with the SEC, one should be aware of that. And your counsel should be aware of that. The SEC will be able to identify insider trading patterns more readily. They may be able to test facts that you provide as a registrant to them, and they may be able to test their own internal theories. I believe the SEC staff comes up with lots of different theories about what's going on in the market, one in a desire to be proactive, and is then testing them, working with the data analytics. A few practice tips that you may keep in mind. Because the SEC has so much of a bigger view, is able to corroborate information, it's really important at companies to consistently communicate the importance of SEC compliance. And in that vein, re-examine your ethics and compliance programs and focus on your internal controls to make sure they are strong. If there are whistleblowers or employees who have items they want to discuss, encourage that because you want to have a flow of information so you have as much information as the company as the SEC does. And then finally, consider how internal communications at your company might be viewed by an SEC attorney or from an investor perspective, because the SEC may get access to that information more readily than they have in the past. That's it, Mike.
Well, thanks, Elizabeth. And we're right at the top of the hour. I want to thank our speakers today and thank all of you for attending. Please feel free to reach out to the speakers, who I'm sure would be more than happy to answer questions. If you're not currently a Merrill client, don't be bashful. Reach out to your sales rep or lure me to discuss what we might be able to do to help you achieve higher quality. In terms of the event itself, reminders, CPE certificates are available now for download. Slides are available for download. A link will be coming to you via email within the next 48 hours. I mentioned the survey. It would be really helpful if you could fill out that survey. And again, thank you very much. Hope this was helpful and appreciate your time.